Those who have been to a ruined wedding, what happened? Oh boy, buckle up for this wild ride. So, a friend of mine was invited to a wedding in Italy. The dream destination, right? The couple flew everyone out a few days early, and the plan was to have this epic joint bachelorette party. The idea was simple. The bride and groom would separate for their respective celebrations, then meet back at the hotel later that night. Probably intoxicated and ready to rest after a fun-filled evening. Everything was going as planned, until about midnight when the bride returned to the hotel. She headed up to the room she was sharing with her soon-to-be husband, probably ready to laugh about the night's antics and get some sleep before the big day. She slides the key card into the door, steps inside, and is immediately struck with a sight that no amount of pre-wedding jitters could have prepared her for. There, sitting on the edge of the bed, is her fiancé and his old habits. Apparently, this guy had an odd habit he'd carried since childhood. Whenever he got anxious, he'd revert to this infantile comfort mechanism, nursing from his mother. Needless to say, the bride was blindsided. She had no idea this was something her future husband did, let alone that his mother was fully on board with it. So, as you can imagine, she completely lost it. They're talking full-blown meltdown mode. She stormed out of the room, screaming and crying, and didn't hesitate to tell every single person she encountered what she just witnessed. By the time the sun came up, the damage was irreversible. The wedding was officially called off and everyone scrambled to book flights home. As for the groom, he was nowhere to be found, likely hiding in shame. And honestly, who could blame him? They didn't show his face around anyone for a long, long time after that. I know this sounds like something straight out of a twisted comedy sketch, but I swear, both my friend and his partner confirmed it's 100% true. Hands down the most jaw-dropping, insane story. Story 2. I kind of ruined a moment at a wedding about 7 or 8 years ago. The bride was a close friend of my girlfriend, and the wedding was set in a truly stunning venue. Lush greenery surrounded us, perched high on a hill overlooking the ocean. It was picturesque, the kind of place that feels like a dream. Everything was going smoothly throughout the day, with heartfelt speeches, laughter, and the couple basking in the glow of their love. As the evening progressed, a group of the bride's other friends, who were quite artsy and bohemian, decided they wanted to release a bunch of Japanese floating lanterns. You know the kind I mean, those delicate paper lanterns where you place a tea candle inside, light it, and watch it rise into the sky, carried away by the breeze. It sounded lovely and whimsical, fitting the romantic atmosphere of the wedding. However, it was midsummer, right in the middle of wildfire season. In fact, I could see the glow and smoke from a nearby fire over the next hill. The wind was blowing from the sea inland, creating a perfect storm of conditions for a potential disaster. At that point, I had probably had a few too many drinks, and it didn't dawn on me until later that I was ruining the moment. As they prepared to launch these lanterns into the sky, I felt an instinct to speak up. I pointed out that releasing a bunch of candles into the air didn't seem like a good idea, especially with firefighters battling a raging blaze just a few kilometers away. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of the world as I was suddenly at the center of attention, with about 20 people staring at me in stunned silence, bride and groom included. Their expressions ranged from confusion to disappointment, and I could almost hear the collective thought of, "What are you doing?" echoing in the air. Thankfully, the couple had planned plenty of other activities for the evening, and we quickly moved on to the next part of the celebration. But I could feel the tension lingering in the air. It's one of those rare situations in life that leaves you feeling both proud and mortified at the same time. Proud for having the foresight to speak up, but mortified for drawing so much attention to myself in such an important moment of their wedding. As for the couple, I recently heard they're getting divorced now. It's sad, really, considering the beautiful day we all witnessed. It's a reminder that even the most magical moments can be complicated. Story 3. My dad and stepmom's wedding was a disaster, a culmination of familial tensions and personal concerns. My stepmom's family was the source of distress. Her parents were estranged, with her father being particularly unpleasant and her mother who was neglectful. Her step-parents, meanwhile, were indifferent to her, leading her to seek solace and escape by turning to my father in her younger years. This background set the stage for the chaotic wedding day. Adding to the complexity, it was my dad who brought his own set of concerns to the table. His relationship with his own mother was strained at best. He harbored deep-seated resentment and blamed her for many of his life's misfortunes. This pattern of blaming women in his life continued with my stepmom. It was no surprise then that their wedding was destined to be a disaster. The day began with an unfortunate incident during the ceremony. As my stepmom walked down the aisle, only her father was there to escort her. Due to a recent argument with her stepfather, the wedding was held outdoors and a branch obstructed their path. Her father made a show of removing the branch, only to fling it back into her moments later, laughing uncontrollably. Despite her awkward chuckle and effort to mask her hurt, it was evident that it upset her, setting a negative tone for the rest of the day. The situation worsened after the toasts. Despite the careful planning to ensure her mother wouldn't drink, she had even been given soda instead of champagne. Her mother went uncontrollably. As my stepmom changed into her reception dress, her mother made the rounds, guzzling down as much drink as she could. When a cousin of mine, oblivious to the drama, began chanting, "Chug, chug, chug," it only added to the chaos. By the time my stepmom returned, her mother was intoxicated and in denial about her drinking. This led to a heated argument, with my stepmom eventually going back to her car to cry. She remained away for about 20 minutes before rejoining the festivities. Meanwhile, the wedding reception was marred further by involving my grandmother. She arrived and started a loud confrontation with my dad, voicing grievances about the wedding, including her hatred for marrying someone younger, her exclusion from inviting a friend, and financial disputes. My dad, already on edge, responded harshly, telling her to leave, which only added tension. Upon returning, my dad's frustration with the day's events turned towards my stepmom. He accused her of being overly emotional or even unfaithful, exacerbating her distress. She tried to compose herself in the event, making sure to stay visible to him while battling her tears. Despite a decade of dating, the marriage was short-lived, ending just 6 months later. The wedding, intended to be a joyous celebration, became a painful reminder of the unresolved problems and strained relationships that led to its collapse. Story 4. I played a wedding where we started playing the set. Everyone ran outside and nobody was to be seen for the rest of the night. I originally assumed it was because nobody likes us, but the bride came in afterwards and said there was an argument involving members of both families, and everyone basically went home upset, injured or in a police van. We couldn't stop playing since we were paid and it was our job. And the only person watching was the hammered uncle dancing on his own, asking for requests we didn't know. The hammered uncle dancing by himself all night sounds like something that would happen at a Sims wedding. Story 5. I was not born yet, but my parents rented the observation deck in the Hancock Building in Boston for the reception. Tallest building in the city, beautiful view. My dad pored over his historic weather charts to figure out what day was statistically most likely to be nice out. Day of the wedding comes, and of course, thick fog unlike anything they'd ever seen before. Couldn't see a thing out the windows of the room they had picked specifically for the view. Worked out well, though. They were happily married for nearly 30 years before illness took my dad's life a few years ago. There's one other funny anecdote from that wedding. The wedding was held in King's Chapel, which is an incredibly historic church here in downtown Boston that's somewhat of a tourist attraction. To close that on a weekend afternoon for a wedding, it turns out it was not very expensive. The tourists waiting outside to see the church didn't know that, though. And someone started the rumor that my parents were incredibly wealthy, maybe even Kennedys. As a result, there were tons of people taking photos of them when they left the ceremony. Not sure if any of them ever figured out that my parents were most certainly not rich nor famous. Story 6. I was the best man at my sister-in-law's wedding and stepped in for the brother of the groom. That's another story entirely. For a whole year of planning, all the bride wanted was a dove release while they said handwritten vows to each other. Very small, non-denominational wedding. Most of the family are atheists anyway. The day arrives in early summer and something is off with the bird handlers. They show up a bit late and are sourcing help from the wedding party to get everything in line. When the time comes to say their vows, I help the handler carry the chest with the doves in it over to what is to be the altar where the bride and groom are standing. Vows are just about wrapping up and the handler gives me the signal to open the chest. I open it and see 20 to 30 immobile doves in the crate. I immediately close it to try and limit who knows what happened, but it's too late. The look of horror on her face was all that was needed. We spent the next few hours trying to cheer everyone up, but by the end of the reception, the entire wedding party had organized and filed animal complaints on the handler. It was all anyone could focus on. Story 7. I was studying photography and used to act as an assistant to a well-known wedding photographer. Went to a couple's wedding. He used digital and I used black and white film. Spent all day with the couple from 9 a.m. through till 2 a.m. in the next morning when we left. I could see how genuinely in love they were. It was only a day, but I got to know them quite well and really liked them both. The next morning I got a call from the photographer and his voice was shaky. He explained that the groom had been found lifeless that night after the reception party. 3 guys had broken into their bungalow to steal wedding gifts. The groom got out of bed to stop them but was harmed. I was in shock for about 2 weeks. This story was in South Africa, if that helps explain how or why this happened. The next weekend, the photographer and I went to the bride's house to present her with the photos. We'd worked together to get the job accelerated, so she had the photos of her husband. We did it at our own expense. They didn't charge her a penny for the day or all the prints and album. Sort of the least we could do. Because my photos didn't matter as much, I've been able to simply capture those natural moments between them, rather than staged wedding photos. So they had the normal album pics, but also about 150 snaps of just them being a couple. She was in tears from the moment we arrived till we left a few hours later. She was a shadow of the woman I'd met only a week earlier. Story 8. I work at a golf course with a lot of history behind it. We do wedding venues inside the clubhouse, and the actual ceremony is held outside by the historic water fountain and large pond. First problem was the weather. I live in the high desert and it was very warm, a solid 90 degrees that day, and it was also pretty windy. So everyone's outside, no umbrellas, no easy ups. The next problem, and probably the worst, was the golf cart incident. The bride and groom wanted to ride into the sunset on one of our golf carts, drive around a little bit on the golf course. To be fair, it is beautiful on the course during sunset. However, the cart had somehow gotten a nail in the tire. Tire went flat, battery in the cart malfunctioned. It came to a complete stop from 15 miles per hour to 0. The wheels and mechanisms locked up, almost seizing. Both the bride and groom both fell. They were totally okay, so retrieving that car was fun. And last but not least, the power inside the clubhouse went out due to high winds. There was no after party available. Only the cake was cut, hardly any food was given out. Yeah, not a great day to cover for someone on your day off. Story 9. I went to a wedding where the bride and groom brought the wedding package in Groupon, which is fine. Why spend a fortune for one day? But I guess the venue thought they could cut some corners. So they stuck us in a room that smelled so strongly of cat mess, some people immediately left. The only drinks were those from a vending machine. It was next to an airport, so every time a plane took off, the ceremony had to be paused because you couldn't hear anything. And the day after the event, every single one of us had food-related illness. I was a bridesmaid for my friend, flew across the world for over 10 hours to be there. Had to do the setup of the venue, assign people to rooms, put signs indoors, finish the seating chart, transport food, redo her bouquet because she didn't like it. The whole time she's rude and tells everyone within earshot that the bridesmaids aren't helping. Her maid of honor was bending over backwards trying to keep her happy. And instead of being grateful, she instead told her sister, "I should have asked you to be my maid of honor instead." She was pretty cold to me and kept asking if I'd lost weight. I said yes because I had been ill but didn't think much of it. At the reception, her new husband takes the opportunity to read the speech she clearly wrote for him to say to me, "We're so glad you fit into your dress." In front of over 100 people. I don't speak to her anymore, and neither does her maid of honor or other bridesmaid. Story 10. Somewhere there exists a picture of me in stage blacks in the middle of an intoxicated wedding reception conga line. My boyfriend at the time was doing sound for the band, as they'd intended to have all live music. Something like 60 out of 100 people showed up. There was a snowstorm involved, without missing a beat. Invited all of the venue staff, including people who weren't even working the wedding, to come eat and dance. The bride's mother DJ'd for an hour with her daughter's no-nonsense attitude so the band could eat. Meanwhile, the groom and his groomsmen, still in their tuxedo attire, insisted on helping with a loadout of just a drum kit and a few speakers. I have no idea who these people were, but would bet money I can't afford to lose that they're still happily married. Story 11. I used to work at a pretty upscale catering hall in New Jersey back in college. We had 2 instances where I witnessed a wedding disaster. The first story is simple. The bride and best man caught out in the car. But the second story, we all thought it was weird when a couple of the groomsmen asked for the reception room during cocktail hour for decorating. Not something we normally see the men do. In any case, we get through the courses just fine. And one thing becomes clear to us staff. The bride's side of the family is very conservative. They didn't drink, they barely danced, and they watched wild-eyed as the groom's side of the party went wild. Now it's time for the speeches. About halfway through his speech, the best man says something along the lines of, "Hey bride's family, I know you think your girl is so sweet and innocent and Christian, and they're the perfect couple. But if you want to see what they're really like, look under your seat." Well taped under every chair was a picture of the bride and groom caught in the act. The groom's family and friends roared with laughter, but the bride's side was mad. There were so many arguments that broke out that night. The wedding was pretty much over at that point. Story 12. I've been to a few, but this is the most soap opera-like one. I made a dessert table for a disastrous wedding at my old country club job once. As I'm setting up, people start shuffling in their mind. The actual marriage ceremony is supposed to be going on at that moment, so nothing is fully set up. Couples nowhere to be found. It felt more like a memorial service than anything else. Just people talking quietly amongst themselves. I tracked down the wedding photographer since I know he'll probably have details, and find him chatting with a bridesmaid. The couple in question was both conservative and young. The groom had been sent to a Pray Away the Sassy camp during high school after being discovered dating his best friend. He spent about a year there before returning home. Once back, he met his future bride, They decided to get married. However, about 2 months before the wedding, he unexpectedly ran into the friend he had been caught with. This reunion rekindled old feelings in their friendship. As they began to spend time together again, the groom started to question his choices and the path he was on. As the wedding approached, he became unsettled and started to have doubts about the marriage. The night before the wedding, he made a dramatic decision. He went to the friend's house, confronted his true feelings, and realized he was still attracted to men and wanted to be with his friend. He called the bride to explain that he could not go through with the wedding. Despite his call, the bride refused to accept that he wouldn't be showing up. Determined to proceed with the ceremony, she went through the extensive preparations, including getting ready, taking pictures, and heading to the venue. When the groom failed to appear as he had warned, the bride's frustration boiled over. At the church, while everyone could hear, she engaged in a heated phone conversation with him. Over the speakerphone, he proclaimed loudly, "I like men. I love him. And my parents can't force me anymore. This isn't about you, and you'll thank me in the long run." Story 13. I'm a wedding photographer, and I had the opportunity to cover a particularly extravagant wedding a few years back. It was a classic outdoor event at a posh location tucked away in a remote area, far from the hustle and bustle of the city life. The venue was stunning, featuring a grand concrete stairway that was flanked by elegant water fountains, leading down to a beautifully set altar. The design was meant to make the bride appear as if she were descending from heaven, and it certainly had an impressive visual impact. The ceremony started as expected, with the bridal party making their way down the stairs and taking their places. However, when the bride made her entrance with her father, a tragic mishap occurred. As she took her first few steps down the concrete stairs, her shoe slipped, causing her to lose her balance. She fell down and the impact was severe. The scene was chaotic, with red liquid everywhere and her pain evident. Given the remote location of the venue, it took around 40 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, which must have felt like an eternity for her. During that time, she was in pain. Thankfully, she survived the ordeal, and after a few weeks, I received an email from the couple with a rescheduled date for the wedding. This time, they had made sure there were no stairs in sight, clearly opting for a much safer setup. Story 14. This didn't happen at a wedding, but at a 30-year wedding anniversary. I was working as a waiter at an inn. We had ballrooms for private parties and other bigger events. The bride and groom had spared no expense. About 100 guests, 5-course meals, an open bar, a whole-day party. We were supposed to close it at 4 in the morning. It was grand, and one of the biggest parties I had waited on so far. After the main course, the husband stood up and held a speech, a long one. They started out reminiscing of when they had met, their early life together, the difficult times they had endured. He then talked at length about how he loved the children she had birthed him, and told each of them how proud he was of them, their character and accomplishments. So far, it was one of the better speeches I had ever heard. It was heartfelt, it had a lot of charisma. He was well-spoken and funny. But then he turned to his wife again. He told her that he had hated her for the last 4 years of their life together, that she was toxic, that had made him feel miserable and almost had driven him to harm himself. He told her that he knew she had a lover, pointed him out in the crowd next to his wife and children. He had evidence and was suing for divorce, intending to take everything. He gave her the divorce papers right then and there. Then he announced to everyone that he had gone his own apartment. The movers had moved all his stuff while they were at the party and that he would be leaving shortly and everything was already paid for, so they should stay and enjoy themselves. In the stunned silence that ensued, he tipped all the staff, dishwashers, bosses, waiters, and busboys $200 each and left. Needless to say, all except the family had left the party within the hour. Okay. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 15. The bride and groom got intoxicated and ended up having a major altercation. Their argument quickly escalated into a screaming match and they both stormed out in the courtyard. As the best man, I went to check on them and discovered them rolling on the ground in a very troubling situation. Startled and concerned by the chaotic scene, I intervened. I forcibly moved the bride aside and I briefly pressed the groom's forehead to the sidewalk, only a couple of inches, to break up the argument. My intent was purely to de-escalate the situation, not to cause harm. I immediately apologized and asked if he was okay, to which he replied that he was fine. Despite my attempts to calm things down, the bride started hurting the groom. I pushed her away and told her to leave, which she did with the bridesmaid. Once I released the groom, he began throwing tantrums at nearby trees. I realized the situation was beyond my control, so I asked the bridesmaid to fetch a police officer from inside the hotel where the wedding was held. The officer arrived and tried to help the groom back to his room. However, the groom continued to act out, disrespecting the officer. Eventually, the situation led to the groom's arrest. His father disowned him on the spot and yelled at the bride. Meanwhile, my date and I took care of the bride and groom's child and stayed in their honeymoon suite for the night. To clarify the pressing his forehead part, the groom and the bride were arguing and I could only see them struggling in the dark. My intervention was to break up their confrontation. I wasn't trying to inflict harm, just stop their argument. After I let him up, he was overwhelmed by the situation. Despite my efforts to calm him, he became more agitated and ended up in jail. Hammered people can be irrational, and reasoning with them can be almost impossible once they're in that state. Story 16. When I was younger, my dad owned a collection of vintage and veteran cars. He used to take them to weddings, and I loved helping him clean out the confetti from the car when he came home. One particular week, he returned without any confetti in the car, which was unusual. It turned out that on the way to the church, the bride had a sudden change of heart. Instead of continuing to the church, she requested to be dropped off at the local zoo, her favorite place, with her father. So, my dad obliged and left them there in their full wedding attire, but planned to get a taxi back to the church when they were ready. This happened before the days of mobile phones, so I imagine the guests at the church were left waiting for quite a while, wondering where the bride and her father had gone. For context, veteran cars are those made before 1919. And vintage cars are those made between 1919 and 1930 in the UK. I just called my dad to ask if he remembered this incident. He mentioned that, from what he could gather, the bride was likely marrying because she was pregnant and felt it was expected of her. This was in the early 1980s. He also recalled that he had 2 weddings where the groom never showed up. Story 17. After the ceremony, the bride and groom decided to go get a few pictures, but they ended up disappearing for about 5 hours. During their absence, we all waited at the venue, but with no communication from them. The buffet remained untouched and the DJ didn't play any music. After 2 hours of waiting, most of the guests pulled together some cash and persuaded the venue manager to set up the buffet and get the DJ to start playing music. So we ended up starting the party without the wedding couple. When they finally returned, they were stunned to find that most of the food was gone. The guests were already dancing and enjoying themselves, and the focus of the event had shifted entirely away from them. While the wedding itself was fun, everything around it had gone awry. Despite the disruption, the guests ended up having a great time once we took matters into our own hands. Since there's been a lot of curiosity about the situation, it turns out the couple did use the time for photos. The photographer, who was quite frustrated, did his best to capture their images. However, the couple was rather vain and expected the photographer to work some magic to make them look perfect. The photographer tried to convince them to return to the venue earlier, but their expectations were unrealistic and he was understandably upset by the whole ordeal. Story 18. I worked at a hotel where one particularly unforgettable incident involved the groom and the maid of honor. They were caught on the hotel roof, which was quite shocking. To make matters worse, they ended up leaving in the limo that had been reserved for the bride and groom, leaving the actual bride stranded. The bride, inconsolable and devastated, remained in the hotel lobby in her wedding dress, sobbing uncontrollably. Despite the best efforts of the hotel staff and guests to comfort her, she was unable to be moved or consoled. She sat there, crying for hours, completely overwhelmed by the situation. Given the response to this story, I thought I'd share another memorable incident from a friend who also worked in the hotel industry. At another big wedding, there was an open bar that led to a heavy flow of drinks. The guests, including the wedding party, were quite rowdy and seemed to fit a stereotype of white trash despite the formal setting. The ceremony went smoothly, but the reception turned into a wild one. As the night wore on, the party began to run late. The catering manager informed the father of the bride that their time had expired and they needed to start shutting down. This announcement sparked a heated argument with several wedding party members, who complained loudly about the cost and how they were being treated. Eventually, the reception was shut down, but this only fueled the guests' frustration. The party moved to the hotel bar where the drinking continued. With tempers already frayed, it didn't take much for things to escalate. The groom, in an intoxicated state, took a swing at someone. The groomsmen joined in and it quickly became a chaotic scene. Hotel staff managed to get them out of the bar, but the argument spilled onto the front entrance of the hotel. When the police arrived to break up the altercation, the groom decided to take a swing at an officer. This led to him being subdued by the police. Meanwhile, the bride, who had been screaming and egging on the argument from the sidelines, decided to join in. She approached a female officer and took a swing at her. Unfortunately for the bride, this officer was strong and took her down quickly. By this point, the police wagon had arrived and several people, including the bride and groom, were handcuffed and taken to jail. The first night of wedding bliss ended up behind bars, far from the celebration they had intended. Story 19. At a wedding reception, I was outside for a smoke when I spotted the groom's dad sitting alone in the back of his SUV, taking swigs of Knob Creek straight from the bottle. I was quite familiar with the groom's family and knew his father well, so I approached him to see what was going on. It was no secret that the bride had a reputation for being spoiled, but she really outdid herself that night. The entire reception was in disarray. despite everything being exactly as she had requested. The food was not good, the centerpieces were a mess, the decor was off, and even the DJ was not up to par. It seems like nothing could make her happy, and her entire family was quick to join in on the complaints. Meanwhile, the groom's family was trying to avoid the chaos by slipping out through the nearest exits. In contrast, the bride's family was creating havoc, berating anyone they came across. It seemed like the only reason the groom's dad was still around was to be ready to drive his son away if he had a last-minute change of heart. He was clearly ready to be the getaway driver if needed. I ended up joining the groom's dad, sharing cigars and bourbon while waiting for the night to wind down. There was no way I was going back into that mess. My wife and their daughter, who were close friends of the groom's family, had a front row seat to the chaos. The daughter was hammered and looking for a scene, while her mother was equally agitated. My wife, along with a few other level-headed women from the groom's side of the family, had to step in as peacekeepers, making sure that the intoxicated bride's family didn't escalate things further and end up confronting the bride. Despite being upper middle class and not your typical family, the evening turned into a farce of epic proportions. My wife was initially angry with me for not helping more, but once I explained that I was keeping the groom's dad company and providing him with a bit of relief, she understood. It turned out to be one of the most memorable and entertaining evenings I've ever experienced. Story 20. The wedding, though close to being a disaster, did not completely ruin the day or the marriage. It was an English man marrying an Irish woman in Ireland, with the guest list consisting of her family, many of whom were from Northern Ireland, including the nationalist and Republican areas, and his English friends and family. The wedding ceremony itself went smoothly. It was romantic and beautiful, and everything went according to plan. However, things took a turn for the worse during the reception, particularly with the best man speech. This best man was a notably red-faced, Brexit-supporting Englishman, and his speech was both insensitive. He made a series of disrespectful jokes, including comments about recolonizing Ireland, referencing the stag party with a Good Friday analogy, and even ending with a quip about the speeches dragging on like a hunger strike. Throughout this, the English groom, his friends, and family found the speech amusing and laughed along. In stark contrast, the bride's Irish family was visibly outraged. The atmosphere became awkward, and many of the bride's cousins and uncles chose to distance themselves from the groom's family. They refused to mingle, and the reception took on an uncomfortable edge. As I was there as a +1 of one of the bride's cousins, I witnessed firsthand the tension and discomfort. The bride was exceptionally kind and gracious, and despite the best man's speech, the groom appeared to be a decent individual. Unfortunately, since I lost touch with a friend who brought me, I'm unaware of how the marriage has fared since that eventful day. Whoa, that was definitely insensitive. The bride's side must have been irate. Story 21. I've catered many weddings, and there have been some memorable ones. Arguments between guests, wedding cakes falling over, red wine spilt on wedding dresses. The one I'll never forget. An all-day do, small ceremony of a few close friends and family, and a big reception filled with a buffet, every type of food you could imagine, and a free bar. All in the same venue. They had booked and paid for 250 evening guests, but 30 guests turned up at most. My heart broke for this couple. A beautiful converted barn, loads of food and drinks, great music, but no guests. At about 10 p.m., the buffet food had barely been touched. The few guests who were there ate, but it hardly made a dent as it was planned for so many people and the venue was licensed until 11 p.m. I asked the mother of the bride if she wanted me to cover and refrigerate the untouched food so the new couple could take it home, and her response was, "Oh no, there are still a lot of people coming." It was the most awkward I've ever felt in my life. No more guests showed. There was a flash of car headlights in the distance about 10:30 p.m., and the bride beamed when she thought it was latecomers arriving. But no, it was just a taxi arriving to pick up the few who were there. It's the only event I've ever done where we didn't have to force people out of the venue. At 11 p.m., the place was empty. In a nutshell, the bride's parents paid for the day, and the happy couple had zero control over the guest list. Her parents invited all their friends to the evening function, but in reality, it was just associates they wanted to flex on, resulting in no one giving care about an invite to a wedding where they didn't know the bride or groom. It was basically just a networking event for the bride's parents. When your wedding turns into the world's saddest networking event, and the only thing being passed around is the realization that not even free drinks could lure in your parents' friends. Story 22. I was working the bar at the venue when I noticed a wedding going on, and as it turned out, the bride was someone I recognized from school. We weren't exactly friends, but we were in the same year, so there was that vague sense of familiarity. The ceremony itself was pretty nice. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. The bride looked gorgeous. The food smelled amazing, and the whole day had this really pleasant vibe. But then came the transition, where they had to convert the dining area into the evening reception space. That's when things started to go downhill. Naturally, people began buying the bride drinks, and she was happily obliging, as you'd expect. But she wasn't just sipping on them. Mostly rosé, which isn't the most difficult stuff out there, but when you're throwing back 175 milliliters glass like they're shots, and everyone is cheering you on, it doesn't take long to lose count or control. By the time the evening room was set up, the bride was plastered. I mean, completely paralytic. She was so out of this world that she ended up missing two of the most important moments of the night, the cake cutting and the first dance. You can imagine how well that went over. Apparently, her mom was furious, ranting about how her daughter had ruined her own wedding. It was pretty awkward for everyone there, especially considering how the day had started off so well. But the real surprise, the day after I was chatting with someone who followed the bride on Instagram, they pulled up her profile and sure enough, there was a picture from the wedding with a caption along the lines of, "Best day ever." I had to laugh. Yeah, the day was great, but she was definitely not referring to the night. It's funny how social media lets us curate our own little realities, even when reality itself was a total train wreck. Story 23. Super weird, and this will probably get lost in the ether, but I was working as a bartender at a wedding that turned strange. It started like any other wedding. Everyone was happily indulging in their complimentary drinks and making their way through the bar supplies like pros. The atmosphere was lively enough, with the guests mingling and enjoying what was, honestly, pretty mediocre music. After about 3 or 4 hours of this rather standard event, the bride, her mother, a sister, and a few kids decided to put things up a notch. They got down on the floor and started doing this silly rowing boat dance, pretending to row while sitting in the line. It was all in good fun, and soon many other guests joining in, laughing and enjoying the moment. It was a wholesome sight for a wedding, with everyone seemingly having a great time. However, things took a dark turn when the bride's brother stood up. Now, unknown to anyone at the time, he was under the influence of substances. In a matter of seconds, he transformed from a seemingly harmless wedding guest to a complete menace. He began to harm the people in the rowing train. And these weren't just playful taps. Oh no, he was delivering full-on soccer-style kicks, reminiscent of Cristiano Ronaldo, aiming for faces, arms, heads, anywhere he could connect. As the situation spiraled out of control, several staff members, including myself, along with about 8 male attendees, sprang into action. We managed to grab him and escort him out of the venue, though not without a struggle. The aftermath was chaotic. Emergency services arrived in droves. Ambulances and police flooded the hotel, questioning bewildered staff and guests alike. They even had a police officer come to my house the following week to ask me questions about the event. It was surreal, and I couldn't believe that this was happening at a wedding. The festive atmosphere had shattered in an instant, replaced by confusion and fear. As for the bride and her family, I can only imagine how this impacted their life. The brother ended up being arrested, and from what I recently learned, he served 2 years in prison. It's safe to say that the wedding was effectively finished in record time after that incident. All those hopes for a beautiful celebration turned into a nightmare, and the family would be dealing with the fallout for a long time to come. Story 24. Not a wedding, but my daughter's bat mitzvah. A similar kind of celebration, complete with catered food, a DJ, photographers, and all the bells and whistles that come with a big event like this. Everything started off beautifully. The venue was decorated, the kids were laughing and dancing, and the food was delicious. However, things took a turn when my cousin, a well-known substance smoker, decided to bring along some edibles from California. She thought it would be fun and harmless to share them, so she handed some out to my sister, my son, and his girlfriend without a second thought. About 45 minutes into the party, I was sitting with my sister, chatting and enjoying the festivities when suddenly, her eyes rolled back in her head and she went completely unresponsive. Fear set in as I started tapping her face in a desperate attempt to wake her up. Nothing worked. Thankfully, my friend who happens to be a nurse rushed over. She took one look at my sister and immediately yelled for us to call an ambulance. With all this happening, my mother noticed my sister's distress and completely lost it. She had anxiety, fell off her chair, and harmed her head on the floor. Just like that, we were calling a second ambulance. To add to the chaos, my cousin had this odd disorder where he passed out at the sight of red liquid. So when he saw my mother, he struck the floor like a sack of potatoes. Guess what? We had to call a third ambulance. At this point, the staff at the venue were freaking out. They had no idea what was going on and started to think there might be a concern with the food. Meanwhile, the DJ was doing an amazing job of keeping the group of children away from the paramedics and sheriffs while trying to maintain the party vibe. You could feel the tension in the air. But he was a pro, and the kids seemed oblivious to the mayhem unfolding around him. Then we heard a scream from outside. I rushed to see what was happening and found my son completely passed out, so naturally we had to call a fourth ambulance. By this point, the room where the party was held was filled to the brim with paramedics, sheriffs, and about 100 confused guests who had no idea what was going on. It felt like a scene straight out of a movie. My amazing neighbor, who is also a good friend, decided to go to the hospital with my mom, my sister, and my son to make sure they were all taken care of. Meanwhile, the sheriffs confiscated the substances. All of this madness unfolded in about 45 minutes. Surreal. Once the chaos settled down a bit, I turned to my daughter, who was understandably freaking out about everything that was happening. I assured her that everyone would be okay and told her she had just had the most memorable bat mitzvah ever, one that would be talked about for years to come. After things finally calmed down, I found a moment to chat with a photographer. I asked her if this was the craziest thing she had ever witnessed during an event, and she casually replied that just 6 months prior, she had been shooting a wedding where the brother of the bride had harmed the groom at the reception. Talk about a wild comparison. In the end, I was relieved that our drama ended without any detrimental incident, even if it was a night filled with chaos and unexpected trips to the hospital. My daughter's bat mitzvah will surely be a story for the ages, filled with laughter and a few cringeworthy moments that we'll never forget. Story 25. I used to do catering work, and this one time my boss sent me to a remote location in the woods in a beautiful river. I found out while we were loading the truck that the boss wouldn't be going and that I was essentially in charge. My boss promised that everything was taken care of, set up, etc. So you can imagine my surprise when I arrived at this remote location. Literally nothing was set up. We were only about an hour early, so I frantically started trying to get the tent in order. We needed extension cords to run the coffee and tea. There were none. We needed tables to set up the food. There were none. I somehow whipped up impromptu everything for the missing things. Just as the bride and groom are arriving, we blow the fuse for our only power source and the place is plunged into darkness. We reset the breaker and move some stuff around, blow the fuse again. This delicate dance went on for the entire evening. Through speeches, first dance, and the works. I think the worst part of the entire experience was when we went to rinse your dishes before boxing them up and found out that when we blew the fuses, the water pump for the place stopped working and needed to be primed again. At that point, I thought of forgetting about it. We'll take them back dirty, and the crew and I spent several more hours after the long ride home doing them. That was the day I worked a 15-hour shift without a break and still messed up the wedding. Needless to say, I quit that job. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. Catch you in that video.